What if I told you that the world's most famous religious patriarch wasn't actually a mystic at all? Like, what if he was basically a master systems engineer?
Right. Which completely upends the entire paradigm we're used to. I mean, when
Yeah.
you stop looking at ancient history through this lens of, sentimental folklore,
Yeah.
and you start actually applying the rigor of sociology and, well, civilizational architecture, these figures become entirely different entities.
They really do. And for you listening, the inherently curious learner who really isn't afraid to look past the surface, we're going on a journey today.
Oh, absolutely.
Because this might completely rewire how you view one of the most famous yet totally misunderstood figures in human history. I mean, we're talking about Prophet Ibrahim or Abraham.
Yeah, and we are unpacking a highly sophisticated analytical framework here. We're drawing heavily from the Tolu Islam digital audio lectures, specifically lecture 6 of 17.
Right, the deep cuts. But let me just set the tone right out of the gate for this deep dive. We are not doing some standard theological study today.
No, definitely not.
We are leaving all the religious sentimentality right at the door.
Which is, frankly, absolutely necessary. I mean, the moment you introduce mysticism, you basically stop analyzing the actual mechanics of how a society is built.
Exactly, you get lost in the clouds.
Right. And the framework we are exploring today argues that the foundational texts, specifically the Quranic texts, present a highly rational, programmatic approach to leadership.
It's a socioeconomic blueprint. But before we even get to Ibrahim, there is this massive roadblock we have to clear first.
Start of the burden of proof issue.
Yes, because as an audience, whether we are talking about ancient history or even just like modern politics, we have this deeply ingrained habit. We put the burden of proof entirely on the messenger.
We really do. We demand to be convinced.
Right, we demand a miracle or just this overwhelming argument that absolutely forces our hand.
We want coercion. We want the outcome guaranteed for us so we don't have to do the intellectual heavy lifting ourselves.
Exactly. But the analysis we're looking at today brings in this massive corrective to that exact mindset.
It really does. It specifically points to Surah Al-Ankabut, Ayat 18.
And what does that say?
Well, the verse states, "And if you deny nations before you denied, the messenger's duty is only the clear conveyance."
Wow. Okay, so the Arabic term used there is al-bala al-mubin, right?
Yes, al-bala al-mubin.
Let's break that down because I feel like the English translation, clear conveyance, might actually be underselling the impact of that phrase.
It absolutely undersells it. I mean, bala implies conveying something to its absolute logical completion.
Like you aren't just dropping a flyer in a mailbox.
Exactly. You are delivering the case so thoroughly that there is zero missing data. And mubin means unambiguous, like crystal clear.
Okay, so when you put them together, the actual job specification of a reformer is just transmission. It's not the coercion of an outcome.
Right. The reformer's responsibility is strictly bounded. They owe the world a clearly delivered case.
But what you like, the audience listening right now, what you do with that case is entirely your own account.
And that right there is the engine of reason for this entire framework. It draws this clean, impenetrable line between the supply of truth and the uptake of truth.
The division of labor, essentially.
Exactly. Think about the psychological evasion that's happening when an audience demands that a prophet, make them believe.
Oh, they're trying to offload their own analytical responsibility.
That's spot on. It is the exact same evasion as demanding a supernatural miracle instead of just taking the time to weigh a complex socioeconomic argument.
That is fascinating. But wait, let me push back a bit. If a messenger delivers this brilliant world-saving blueprint and the people just reject it,
Yeah.
doesn't that mean the messenger failed? I mean, that's how we measure success in almost every other field. Like, if you pitch a product and nobody buys it, the salesman failed.
I get that, but that is a purely market-driven perspective.
Huh.
It doesn't apply to the mechanics of fundamental truth.
Why not?
Because look at the specific phrasing in the source text. It says, "If you deny nations before you denied." The text actually normalizes denial. Yeah, it recognizes rejection as recurring, entirely predictable human behavior. It depersonalizes the rejection completely.
It's essentially saying, like, hey, we have seen this data point before. Don't take it personally.
Precisely. The messenger is not defective just because some people reject a clear message. Rejection is just a known, repeating variable in the human system.
Okay, so the rational division of labor is literally this. The sender guarantees the clarity and completeness of the data, and the receiver owns the processing.
Yes. And that introduces a pretty terrifying level of accountability for the audience,
It
right?
really does, because if the burden of processing is entirely on me, then the fallout of ignoring the data is also on me.
Which brings us right to the law of requital.
Mukafat diamo.
Exactly. Requital follows this exact division of labor perfectly. If the reformer delivers the message clearly, they have discharged their function completely regardless of the reception.
So their hands are clean.
Their hands are clean. But if you reject a clear delivery, the consequence belongs entirely to you, because the information that could have corrected your course was made fully available.
So that reminder, nations before you denied, that's actually a really stark requital reminder.
Yes, it is. Their denial did not stop the civilizational consequences of their actions from arriving.
So the permanent principle here, the big takeaway, is that the reformer owes the world a clear case, not a guaranteed conversion.
Which completely frees the agent, the prophet in this case, from the impossible task of forcing belief.
And it frees us, the listeners, to actually evaluate the message on its merits. We don't have to feel like we are being manipulated or coerced.
Exactly. And with that boundary established, we can finally look at Ibrahim.
Right, because he wasn't sent to perform magic tricks.
Not at all. He was sent to convey a specific, highly engineered blueprint for human society. And to understand that blueprint, we really have to look at the evolutionary elite his era represented.
Because things operated on a much smaller scale before him, right? I mean, we have figures like Noah, Hud, Salih. The framework suggests their missions were strictly localized.
The scope was entirely different back then. The divine social order for those earlier eras was highly localized and, frankly, nationalistic.
How so?
Well, it operated within the bounds of a specific tribe's immediate socioeconomic or agricultural problems. You fix a local rot and you move on.
It was a patch job.
Basically, yeah. But Ibrahim's era marked a definitive structural shift.
It was a leap toward universalism.
Right, humanity at large. The objective was no longer to just patch up a single tribe. The goal was to establish a permanent system for all of mankind across all of time.
And obviously, if you are going to build a system for the entire globe, you need a tangible physical center, like a headquarters.
You absolutely do.
Okay, let me pause you there.
Yeah.
Because if I am an ancient king or even just a modern CEO and I want to build a global capital that commands respect.
You're looking for prime real estate.
Exactly. I want access to shipping lanes. I want lush agricultural land to feed my massive administrative population. I want natural defenses.
You'd build it in the fertile valleys of Syria or the Nile Delta or Mesopotamia?
Right. That's what human empires have done for millennia.
But this framework points out a deliberate geopolitical masterstroke. The center of this universal movement was not established in any of those wealthy lands.
It was established in the Hijaz.
Specifically, in a valley described in the text as Wadi Gher di Zarin.
Which means a completely barren, uncultivated valley.
Exactly. We are talking about an area with zero natural attractions.
No greenery.
None. No agriculture, no rivers, just rocks, sand, and heat.
And to be clear, no oil springs at the time either. I know people might think of modern wealth, but the petroleum was millennia away.
Oh yeah, at the time of this establishment, it was a harsh, completely unforgiving wasteland.
So I'm trying to wrap my head around the logic here. As a systems engineer, why build the most important headquarters in human history in a place where people can barely survive?
Because of what the center represents. By designating this barren rock in the middle of nowhere as the house of God, the center is deliberately and permanently stripped of all national, tribal, or personal ownership.
Oh, wow. It is explicitly designated Lul-Nas for all mankind.
Exactly. Because think about it. If you build it in the lush valleys of Syria, the local inhabitants, who already have wealth and power, are just going to claim it as their native crown jewel.
Right. They would assert a nationalistic monopoly over it. They would be like, this is our temple in our fertile land, and you are just visitors.
But by putting it in a wasteland, it neutralizes any geopolitical claim. You cannot claim agricultural or territorial supremacy over a valley that produces absolutely nothing.
It's like, imagine if we tried to build the United Nations headquarters, but instead of putting it in New York City, where American geopolitical influence is just inescapable,
Right.
we built it on an artificial platform in the middle of international waters in the Pacific.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it.
By choosing a location with zero inherent native wealth, you eliminate the risk of any one superpower claiming it as their exclusive property.
It forces the location to be purely ideological rather than territorial. It belongs to everyone because nobody actually wants to conquer it for its resources.
That is incredibly smart.
And the analysis tracks this genius even further by looking at the branching of Ibrahim's own lineage.
Okay, break that down for me.
Well, you have the Bani Israel, the branch through Isaac. Geographically and systematically, they remained within a nationalistic framework for a very long time.
Right. Their system was deeply tied to specific lands, like the Promised Land, and specific bloodlines.
Exactly. But then you have the Bani Ishmael, the branch through Ishmael. They were the ones deliberately positioned in this barren Hijaz valley.
So they were geographically isolated from the great empires, like Rome and Persia.
Yes. And those empires didn't care about the Hijaz because there's literally nothing to tax or extract.
They left it alone.
They completely ignored it, which allowed the Hijaz to serve as an incubator. It was positioned to eventually birth this universal global movement, completely free from the baggage of established imperial territories.
Okay, I absolutely love the strategic neutrality of it, but practically speaking, this creates a massive logistical nightmare.
The food problem.
Yes. If you build your global headquarters in a literal wasteland, how are the people running it supposed to eat? You can't sustain an administrative center on ideology alone.
And this is where the framework offers one of its most fascinating socioeconomic insights. We're talking about the sociology of risk, or sustenance.
Right, because Ibrahim famously prayed for economic provision for the people of this barren valley.
He did. But if you are listening to this, you might have heard this prayer framed as just a father pleading for his children, like a domestic request. Lord, please make sure my kids don't starve in this desert.
Yeah, that's the standard story.
But the analytical lens removes all that sentimentality. This wasn't just about filling stomachs so people could sleep comfortably.
What was it about?
It was a structural, systemic safeguard. It was designed specifically to prevent the caretakers of this new universal center from devolving into religious parasites.
Religious parasites. Explain the mechanics of that, because honestly, that happens in almost every ancient culture.
It really does. Look at the history of religious centers across the globe. Temples, churches, monasteries, shrines. Almost inevitably, they become places where the priestly class, the caretakers, end up extracting wealth from the population.
Right. Without actually producing anything of value themselves, they don't engage in constructive economic labor.
Exactly. They don't farm, they don't manufacture, they don't trade.
So their only revenue stream becomes the religion itself.
They live off the offerings, the tithes, the donations, and the fears of the desperate pilgrims who come seeking spiritual salvation.
Wow.
And the framework points out that if the people living around the Kaaba in this barren valley had no independent economic means, they would inevitably be forced to become mujawirs.
Caretakers who essentially operate as glorified beggars.
Exactly. They would have to rely on the spiritual offerings of the pilgrims just to feed their families. And I mean, when human beings need to feed their families, they will rationalize anything.
Oh, absolutely. We see this degradation historically all the time.
You get figures charging exorbitant fees just to unlock the door of a holy site.
Yeah, or they invent new rituals, new superstitions, new necessary sacrifices, purely to generate more donations.
It becomes a literal toll booth.
So if a religious center cannot feed itself through independent economic means, it will eventually sell its religion to survive.
Which is exactly why Ibrahim's prayer for economic prosperity for Rizq was a vital piece of the architectural blueprint. By guaranteeing that this center would have its own robust economic sustenance, the system ensures that the center remains economically independent.
But how did that actually manifest? If it's a desert, where does the wealth actually come from before modern oil?
It manifested through the establishment of massive secure trade routes.
Commerce.
Yes. Because the Kaaba was designated as a neutral, safe sanctuary where all violence was prohibited, it organically became the perfect hub for ancient commerce.
So warring tribes could come there to trade without fear of being robbed or killed.
Exactly. That geopolitical neutrality generated immense mercantile wealth for the caretakers.
That is incredibly elegant. It's a built-in anti-parasitic model. Ibrahim wasn't praying for a magical food drop from the sky. He was establishing a solid economic policy.
He was.
Because if the inhabitants are wealthy through legitimate trade, they don't need to shake down the pilgrims. They don't need to monetize the sacred.
The purity of the universal message is protected by the economic independence of its transmitters.
Okay, so fixing the economy brings us to the next structural hurdle.
Leadership.
Right. You have a geographically neutral universal center. You have a model for economic independence to prevent a parasitic priest class. But who controls all that wealth? Who actually gets to run this operation?
That is the ultimate question of power. And this is where the framework takes a sledgehammer to one of the oldest, most destructive concepts in human civilization.
The divine right of kings. Leadership by bloodline.
Yes. For almost all of recorded history, the default mode of power transfer was purely biological. The king's son becomes the king. The high priest's son becomes the high priest.
It was this massive assumption that greatness, capability, and justice were just genetic traits passed down through DNA.
And obviously, history is littered with the disastrous results of that assumption.
Oh, totally. A brilliant founder is often followed by a completely incompetent heir who just burns the empire to the ground.
But the blueprint we are examining today absolutely destroys the concept of inherited leadership.
How so?
It highlights that Ibrahim is appointed as an imam, a leader for all of mankind. But this appointment is not arbitrary. It only happens after he successfully passes massive, agonizing, systemic tests.
So he had to earn the mantle through a crucible of character.
Exactly. Think about the sociological weight of those tests. He had to confront his own idol-making father, which meant severing his immediate domestic safety net and his economic security.
He had to stand alone.
He defeated Nimrod, the tyrant king who claimed the power of life and death, which meant literally risking public execution. And he faced the fire, the ultimate test of physical survival for his principles.
He proved his systemic integrity under the maximum possible pressure.
He did.
But then, and I think this is my favorite part of the historical record, Ibrahim asks the question any founder of a dynasty would naturally ask. He turns to God and says, "Will this leadership be inherited by my descendants? Will my lineage carry this imamate?"
And the response is swift and incredibly uncompromising.
What is it?
My covenant does not include the wrongdoers
Mm-hmm.
or, the unjust. It is a hard, definitive rejection of unconditional inheritance.
I just want to pause and let that sink in for the listener. The founder of the system, a man who just survived the fire, is told straight to his face that his kids do not get a free pass.
The framework leans heavily into the biological reality here. It uses a very stark analogy from the text. A sheep gives birth to a sheep.
Right.
Physical, biological traits are inherited. But the capabilities of human character, intellect, and leadership, those are not inherited.
You cannot inherit courage. You cannot inherit justice or a deep understanding of systems engineering.
Exactly. They have to be forged generation by generation through individual effort. Therefore, leadership in this newly architected system is strictly meritocratic.
So being the literal biological son of Ibrahim means absolutely nothing if you do not possess his character.
The system firmly rejects the nepotism that eventually rots every human institution from the inside out.
But wait, historically, his descendants did become leaders. I mean, you look at Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, David, Solomon. How does the framework reconcile that with a strictly meritocratic system? Doesn't that just look like a bloodline dynasty?
That is a crucial distinction to make. They became leaders not because they were his biological descendants, but because they individually met the same grueling standards of meritocracy.
Ah, I see.
When a descendant failed that test, when they acted unjustly, they were immediately stripped of that covenant, exactly as the verse warned.
So the blueprint doesn't preclude a son from succeeding a father. It just precludes him from succeeding automatically without passing the crucible.
Exactly. The standard is everything.
Okay, so if blood isn't the standard, but character is, what exactly made Ibrahim's character so unique that he became the ultimate benchmark for this meritocracy?
To answer that, the analysis looks at the very specific terminology used in the text to describe his operational mode.
Okay.
The text describes him not just as a man, but as an entire ummah.
Usually we translate ummah as a nation or a massive community. To call one guy an ummah seems like, well, a bit of hyperbole.
It seems like it, but it isn't hyperbole. It is a description of his output. He was literally an institution unto himself.
Okay.
The text pairs this with two other terms, qanita, which means obedient or perfectly channeling, and hanafan, which means intensely focused, cutting out all peripheral distractions.
And the framework provides an incredible, vivid analogy to explain what this looks like in practice, right? It compares Ibrahim's character to a water skin in the desert.
Yes. Let's build this out because it completely reframes how we think about human energy.
Mm-hmm.
Consider the modern municipal water truck driving through a city street, washing away the dust.
Sure.
The valve is just wide open and the water is dumping everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
It's a complete scattergun approach. It wastes resources where they aren't strictly needed because the city operates under this illusion of abundance.
There is zero precision.
Now contrast that with a traveler crossing the Arabian desert with a single traditional Arab water skin, a mashkiza.
That traveler knows the existential value of every single drop.
Exactly. They do not leave the valve open. They guard that water with their life. The mouth of the skin is opened only when and where there is absolute critical necessity. Not a single drop is wasted on the sand.
And the argument is that Ibrahim operated his life exactly like that mashkiza.
He did. He did not waste a single drop of his energy, his intellect, his time, or his resources on distractions.
He didn't leak his potential into petty disputes or domestic drama or just frivolous pursuits.
He dispensed his capabilities strictly according to the systemic objectives. That is supreme, ultimate efficiency.
And that is the true meaning of being an ummah in one man.
When an individual aligns all of their internal faculties, their mind, their resources, their physical stamina, so perfectly toward a singular constructive goal without any leakage, they generate the output of an entire nation.
They become a perfectly efficient system of one.
Exactly. It is absolute laser-focused resource management of the self.
Okay, so look at the picture we have built so far. We have a strategic, geopolitically neutral headquarters in the Hijaz,
Right.
an economic failsafe against religious parasitism through trade, a strict, uncompromising meritocracy that destroys the divine right of kings, and a founder who is the ultimate model of focused, systemic efficiency.
It is, frankly, a flawless architectural blueprint for a civilization.
Which brings us to the great tragedy, and this is where the framework offers its most explosive and honestly controversial analysis.
Yeah, we have to talk about the myths.
Because if Ibrahim's systemic perfection is the entire point, if his unwavering resolve is the foundation of this whole structure, why do so many of our traditional historical stories depict him as deeply flawed?
It's a glaring contradiction.
I mean, if you read traditional commentaries, he is constantly doubtful or lying to save his own skin or entangled in petty domestic soap operas.
This is where the sociological lens fiercely critiques traditional historical compilations. The framework argues that over centuries, secondary texts and traditions have introduced myths that essentially assassinate Ibrahim's character.
We're talking about stories that millions of people accept as historical fact without ever pausing to question the systemic implications.
They just accept them blindly.
Let's walk through the three main myths this framework completely shatters.
Okay, the first myth strikes at the very core of a prophet's conviction. There is a widely accepted traditional story that Ibrahim asked God how it was drawn. He raises the dead, and the tradition interprets this request as Ibrahim harboring internal doubts.
Right. The narrative goes that he says, "Lord, show me how you give life to the dead." And God asks, "Do you not believe?" And Ibrahim supposedly replies, "Yes, but just to reassure my heart."
And the analytical framework argues that interpreting this as doubt is intellectually absurd.
Why?
Think about the profile we just built. A prophet of this magnitude, a man who has already faced the fire and confronted a tyrannical king, does not suddenly lack conviction about the power of God.
It makes no psychological sense.
The text argues he was actually asking for the mechanism, the programmatic method of civilizational revival, not questioning the reality of the divine power.
Oh, that makes so much more sense.
Right. To suggest the founder of this universal system harbored internal doubts is to crack the very foundation of the blueprint. It projects common human frailty onto a figure whose entire purpose was to be the standard of unwavering focus.
The character assassination gets much more direct with the second myth, the claim that Ibrahim explicitly lied 3 times in his life.
This is a massive issue. The traditions claim that to avoid participating in a pagan festival, he lied and claimed he was sick. Then, to avoid a tyrannical king taking his wife Sarah, he lied and told the king she was his sister.
But wait, earlier we established the rule of Bala Mubin, the clear conveyance of truth. If the messenger's fundamental duty is the unambiguous transmission of truth, how can he be a liar?
He cannot. The framework insists that a prophet, who is by definition the ultimate standard of truth, whose entire civilizational mission relies on absolute credibility, cannot use deception.
Right. If a prophet lies, even for a supposedly good cause or under intense pressure, the entire system of truth just collapses.
Exactly. Why should anyone believe the socioeconomic blueprint if the architect lies when things get difficult?
So how does the framework actually explain those stories?
It explains that the Arabic phrases used were rhetorical truths that were later mistranslated or misunderstood by literalist storytellers as deceptive falsehoods.
Okay, give me an example.
For example, being sick of their idolatry was a mental and spiritual state. It wasn't a fake physical cough to get out of a party.
That tracks.
And the sister story regarding his wife is completely debunked by this analysis as a later fabrication, largely imported from other corrupted traditions.
Which brings us to the third myth, which honestly is the most emotionally damaging to the entire blueprint. And if you are listening to this right now, you might have been taught this story your entire life.
The banishment story.
Yes, it is the story that Ibrahim abandoned his wife Hajar and his infant son Ishmael in that barren desert of the Hijaz, purely because his other wife, Sarah, was jealous.
The traditional narrative paints this as a literal domestic soap opera. Sarah gets jealous of Hajar, she issues an ultimatum, and Ibrahim, to keep the peace at home, tragically banishes a mother and a baby to the wilderness and just walks away.
But look at what happens when we view this through the lens of systems engineering. The whole thing completely falls apart.
It does. The analytical framework vehemently rejects this narrative. It calls it a profound insult to the prophet's character and an insult to the intelligence of the system itself.
Think about the glaring contradiction here. We just spent the first half of this deep dive establishing that the relocation to the Hijaz was a highly calculated, programmatic, civilizational chess move.
It was designed to build a neutral, universal headquarters.
Right. It was the ultimate strategic move for humanity's long-term survival.
But this myth reduces that grand architectural move to the result of a petty domestic dispute. It suggests the location of the universal center wasn't divine strategy at all. It was just an accident caused by marital jealousy.
It basically means the Kaaba is in Mecca just because Sarah couldn't get along with Hajar. That is an absurd degradation of the history.
The framework argues that Ibrahim, the perfect Ummah, who never wasted a drop of energy like the guarded waterskin, would never act out of domestic pressure to abandon his family in a wasteland.
It goes against everything he stood for.
Exactly. The relocation was a shared, purposeful mission. Hajar wasn't banished, she was a pioneer. She was an active, willing participant in establishing this new outpost.
Okay, but this raises a massive question for me. Why do these myths even exist? If the original blueprint was so pristine, so logical, so brilliant, how did it get buried under centuries of soap operas and fairy tales?
This is the absolute crux of the sociological analysis. These myths are not just innocent fairy tales, and they aren't just accidental mistranslations either.
What are they?
The framework argues they're a form of institutional sabotage.
Sabotage by who? Like, who actually benefits from making Ibrahim look like a liar or a bad husband?
Later generations of religious leaders, the priest classes, the bureaucrats, the people who wanted to justify their own moral compromises.
Oh, wow.
Think about it systemically. If you were a corrupt religious leader or a compromising politician, the absolute flawless standard of Ibrahim is a massive threat to you. It highlights your own corruption.
So you have to drag the architect down to your level.
Precisely. If you can convince the masses that the greatest prophet, the founder himself, lied for a good cause, you have just written a moral blank check for every future leader to lie, compromise, and deceive whenever it is convenient for them.
Because they can just say, well, if Ibrahim can lie to save his skin, then a modern leader can definitely lie to save theirs.
Exactly. If Ibrahim acted out of domestic jealousy and compromised his family for petty reasons, it gives a permanent pass to later leaders acting on their own petty grudges.
That makes total sense. By dragging the architect down to the level of a flawed, compromising politician, corrupt institutions justify their own rot.
They make the flawless blueprint look muddy so no one notices when they build a crooked house.
That is a chilling realization. We have literally taken a masterclass in strategic civilizational survival, and we have actively chosen to reduce it to a soap opera.
We really have.
By focusing on the manufactured drama, we completely lose the actual architecture.
The text even points out how this degradation leads to absurd superstitions.
Oh, like what?
Well, there are later traditions that claim when Ibrahim was thrown into the fire by Nimrod, all the animals tried to put the fire out, except for a chameleon, which supposedly blew on the fire to make it hotter.
Wait, what? A chameleon blowing on a bonfire?
It's comical, right? But it proves the point. It is a perfect example of how rational history degrades into folklore over centuries.
People start focusing their energy on hating magical lizards rather than studying the immense sociological courage it takes to stand up to a geopolitical tyrant.
It distracts the audience from the real lesson.
It turns the political revolution into a bedtime story.
Exactly.
So if we clear away the soap opera, if we brush off the chameleon myths and the jealousy narratives, we are left with this pristine, highly efficient, meritocratic system.
Yes, the original blueprint.
But how are we supposed to actually interact with Ibrahim's legacy today? Because looking around at the modern world, it seems we mostly just perform rituals in his name.
And that leads to the final major paradigm shift in this framework, redefining the concept of Maqam Ibrahim, or the station of Ibrahim.
Traditionally, if you ask millions of people what the Station of Ibrahim is, they will tell you it is a literal physical stone outside the Kaaba in Mecca,
Right.
a stone with footprints embedded in it, where you are supposed to stand and perform 2 ritual prayers after circling the Kaaba.
It has been reduced entirely to a physical artifact and a physical ritual. But the analysis argues that this is a tragic misunderstanding of the Arabic terminology and the systemic goal of the Quran.
The framework brings in a striking metaphor from ancient Arab culture to explain what maqam actually means in this context. Let's break this down because it perfectly encapsulates the shift from mindless ritual to active participation.
It's a great analogy. It involves the musali in ancient Arab horse racing.
Okay, set the scene for us.
In these ancient races, the leading horse, the one breaking the wind, setting the pace, and charting the path, was the number 1. But the horse that ran in the number 2 spot had a specific title. It was called the Muzali.
And what made the Muzali special wasn't just that it was in second place, right? I mean, a horse 10 lengths behind is technically in second place.
Right, but the Muzali was the horse that tracked the leader so closely, so perfectly, that its head was right at the flank of the leader. There was 0 gap between them.
It didn't fall behind, losing the pace, but it also didn't break formation to try and supersede the leader. It maintained a flawless, sustained alignment with the pioneer.
Exactly. So when the Quran commands humanity to take the station of Ibrahim as a place of salat, or as a musalla,
It absolutely does not mean finding a literal rock you once stood on and praying next to it.
it means becoming the musali. It means running the race of civilizational survival right behind Ibrahim.
Wow.
It means looking at the pace he set, his programmatic efficiency, his absolute rejection of tyranny, his meritocratic values, his economic independence, and adopting that model in your own era.
It means keeping pace with his systemic blueprint across every new generation without falling behind into superstition and without trying to invent a new, corrupted path that supersedes the universal design.
That is how you honor the architect, not by venerating a stone, but by executing the blueprint.
That actually gives me chills. We have spent centuries looking down at a rock when we were supposed to be looking forward, running a race.
We've been missing the point entirely.
When you view it through this lens, we have moved from seeing a religious patriarch in a robe to witnessing a master system builder constructing a blueprint for human survival.
We have seen how he established a geographically neutral, universal center to prevent geopolitical monopoly. We have seen the absolute necessity of economic independence to prevent the rise of parasitic religious classes.
We have explored the strict laws of meritocracy that dismantle the birthright of kings, and the intense danger of letting institutional sabotage and folklore override rational systemic blueprints.
And we started all of this by establishing the fundamental rule of Bala Mubin. The messenger's only job is the clear, unambiguous conveyance of this exact blueprint.
They are not here to force us to believe it through miracles or coercion. They are here to hand us the architectural plans. If we choose to take those plans and turn them into paper airplanes or bedtime stories about chameleons, that failure is entirely on us. The law of requital guarantees that we will face the consequences of ignoring the data.
Which leaves us with a profound realization about our own history and our own present responsibilities.
It really does. And it leaves you, listening to this, with a lingering question to think about. If humanity has spent centuries taking profound, rational, civilizational blueprints and downgrading them into literal physical rituals like standing on a specific stone or telling fairy tales about a desert, what other massive world-changing systems are hiding in plain sight right now, waiting for us to finally read them as the blueprints they were always meant to be?